Hospitals are just expensive theaters for bad actors. You watch families sobbing over a gurney one minute and calculating the inheritance the next. It is a parade of hypocrisy under fluorescent lights. I am Dr. Bernice Howard, and I specialize in fixing broken hearts, even the ones that belong to the people who broke mine. My parents sacrificed my graduation to bail out my worthless brother. But now that death is knocking, they suddenly remember I exist. They wanted a budget rescue for a luxury problem, but I gave them a bill they could not ignore. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air in the operating room was cold, clean, and dangerously quiet. The operating room at St. Jude's Research Hospital was not silent, but it was quiet in the way a cathedral is quiet before a service. There was only the rhythmic, synthetic chirp of the cardiac monitor, a metronome counting out the remaining seconds of a man's life, and the low hum of the bypass machine that was currently doing the work of his heart. I didn't listen to music when I operated. Some surgeons, the ones who like to play at being cowboys, blared classic rock or jazz, treating the theater like a garage, where they were tinkering with a carburetor. I preferred the silence. Silence was honest. In the silence, you couldn't hide a mistake. My hand was steady, hovering over the exposed pericardium. I was deep inside the thoracic cavity of a 45-year-old schoolteacher, navigating the treacherous anatomy of a botched valve replacement performed at a lower-tier facility 3 weeks prior. "Retractor," I said. My voice was low, flat, and devoid of inflection. The scrub nurse, a seasoned veteran named Mags, slapped the instrument into my palm with a satisfying snap. She knew my rhythm. She knew that when I was in the zone, I ceased to be Bernice Howard, a woman in her late 20s, with a studio apartment and a dying ficus plant. In here, I was simply an instrument of correction. I was the thing that fixed what was broken. We were 3 hours into a procedure that typically took 5. The resident across from me, a young man named Evans, with eager eyes and trembling hands, was sweating through his cap. "Dr. Howard," he murmured, his voice tight. "The adhesion on the posterior wall. It's close to the phrenic nerve. If we nick that, he loses diaphragm function." I didn't look up. I didn't blink. I simply adjusted my grip on the scalpel, shifting the angle by perhaps 2 millimeters. "I am aware, Dr. Evans," I replied. My eyes locked on the microscopic field magnified by my loupes. "That is why I am holding the blade, and you are holding the suction. Watch." With a motion that was more intention than movement, I severed the scar tissue. The nerve remained untouched. The artery pulsed free and clear. A collective exhale went through the room, though I didn't participate in it. Relief was an emotion, and emotions caused tremors. I didn't do tremors. They called me the Ice Queen in the break room. I knew this because silence travels and I heard everything. They thought I was cold, devoid of empathy, a surgical robot designed for the impossible cases. They were half right. I wasn't devoid of emotion. I had simply cauterized it years ago, much like the vessel I was currently sealing. By the time I stripped off the bloody latex gloves and tossed them into the biohazard bin, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by the familiar heavy exhaustion that settled in my bones. I moved to the scrub sinks, pressing the foot pedal to unleash a stream of scalding water. I scrubbed my hands and forearms with a bristled brush, scraping away the physical remnants of the surgery, wishing I could scrub the inside of my head just as easily. "Doctor." Evans shuffled up to the sink next to me, peeling off his mask. He looked shell-shocked. "That was incredible, Bernice," he said, using my first name, a liberty I rarely encouraged. "I've never seen a Thornton Vance reconstruction done without a hitch. You made it look like a tonsillectomy." I nodded once, focusing on the soap suds turning pink as they swirled down the drain. "Preparation, Evans. It's all just preparation." He smiled, a goofy, lopsided thing. "Well, I'm glad it's over. My parents are flying in tonight. My mom's terrified of flying, but she wouldn't miss my birthday dinner. You doing anything this weekend? Family in town?" The water ran hot over my skin, but I felt a sudden sharp chill in my chest. Family. The word felt like a foreign object, a piece of shrapnel I hadn't managed to extract. The harmless question transported me instantly, violently back 3 years. The smell of antiseptic soap vanished, replaced by the scent of cut grass and humidity. I was standing on the neatly manicured lawn of the medical school quadrangle. The sun was oppressive, beating down on the black polyester of my graduation gown. Around me, the air was thick with laughter and the popping of champagne corks. Families were everywhere, clusters of proud parents adjusting tassels, fathers clapping sons on the back, mothers weeping into tissues while holding bouquets of overpriced flowers. I stood alone near the edge of the reception tent, clutching my diploma so hard the leather folio was warping under my grip. I scanned the crowd for the 100th time, looking for the familiar shape of my father's stooped shoulders or my mother's floral Sunday dress. There were 2 empty white folding chairs in the 3rd row where they were supposed to be. They had RSVP'd. They had promised. I remembered pulling my phone out of the hidden pocket of my gown. My hands had been shaking, then I hadn't learned how to stop the tremors yet. I dialed my mother. It rang 4 times before she picked up her voice, breathless and distracted. "Bernice, is it over?" she asked, the background noise chaotic and loud. "Yes, Mom," I said, my voice small, pathetic. "They just called my name. I walked across the stage. You weren't there." I heard a sigh on the other end, the sound of a woman inconvenienced by a nagging child. "Oh, honey, I know, and we feel terrible," she said, though she didn't sound terrible. She sounded annoyed. "But look, we're at the courthouse. It's a nightmare. The line for the clerk is out the door." I blinked, the bright sunlight stinging my eyes. "The courthouse? Why?" She lowered her voice to a whisper. "It's Kyle. He got pulled over on the turnpike, driving on a suspended license again. If we didn't come down here to pay the bond and talk to the judge, they were going to hold him over the weekend. You know how sensitive he is, Bernice. He can't handle jail." I stood there surrounded by the greatest achievement of my life, the culmination of 8 years of sleepless nights, caffeine overdoses, and crushing debt, and I realized I had been erased. I was the backup plan, the invisible child. Kyle, my older brother, the golden child, with the charming smile and the gambling addiction, had snapped his fingers, and they had come running. He had broken the law again, and that crisis took precedence over my triumph. "Bernice, are you there?" my mother asked, her voice tinny. "We'll make it up to you. We'll do a dinner next month. Maybe Red Lobster." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt something inside me snap clean and sharp like a dry twig. "Don't bother," I said. It was the first time I had ever spoken to her without seeking approval. "Focus on Kyle. He needs you. I don't." I hung up the phone. I walked to the trash can near the catering tent, tossed the program that had Bernice Howard, MD, summa cum laude printed on it into the garbage, and walked away. I didn't go to the after party. I went to the library. I spent that night studying the Thornton-Vance valve reconstruction, a procedure so rare and difficult that only a handful of surgeons in the country dared to attempt it. I decided then that I would become indispensable to the world, even if I was disposable to my family. I would be so good, so specialized, that no one could ever look past me again. "Bernice, you okay?" Evans was staring at me, concern etching his forehead. The flashback receded, leaving me breathless, as if I had surfaced from deep water. I shut off the tap with a sharp thwack. "I'm fine," I said, my voice returning to its usual steel. "No family, just work." I dried my hands with aggressive precision, throwing the paper towel into the bin with more force than necessary. "Enjoy your dinner, Evans." I turned on my heel and marched out of the scrub room, the heavy doors swinging shut behind me, sealing me back into my fortress of solitude. I checked my pager. I had 10 minutes before rounds, just enough time to grab a black coffee and review the charts for tomorrow. I was safe here. Here the rules were clear. If you followed the protocol, the patient lived. If you made a mistake, they died. It was binary. It was logical. It was nothing like the messy, chaotic swamp of blood relations. I was halfway to the cafeteria when the overhead page crackled. Dr. Howard, Dr. Bernice Howard, please report to the Chief of Surgery's office immediately. The summons was unusual. Chief Miller didn't make social calls, and he certainly didn't page specialized cardiothoracic surgeons in the middle of the afternoon, unless a donor heart had just landed on the helipad. I changed course heading toward the administrative wing. The hospital corridors were a blur of activity gurneys rushing by nurses hurrying with IV bags, but I moved through them with the efficiency of a shark. I reached the chief's office and knocked once. "Enter," Miller barked. He was a stern man, gray-haired and tired, sitting behind a desk buried in paperwork. He looked up as I entered, and for the first time in my 5 years at St. Jude's, I saw hesitation in his eyes. "Sit down, Bernice," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. I didn't sit. "I have a full slate, Chief. What's the emergency?" Miller sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany of his desk. It stopped inches from my hand. "We accepted an emergency transfer 20 minutes ago from a rural county hospital about 3 hours south," he said, his voice heavy. "Critical cardiac failure. Severe mitral valve regurgitation complicated by an aortic aneurysm. It's a mess." I looked at the folder, but I didn't touch it yet. Why me? Why not the on-call trauma team? Miller looked me dead in the eye. "Because the anatomy is distorted. It requires a Thornton Vance reconstruction. You're the only surgeon in the state qualified to perform it. And—" he paused, looking uncomfortable. "And because of the name on the intake form." I felt a cold dread pool in my stomach, distinct from the professional detachment I wore like armor. I reached out and flipped the folder open. The patient ID sticker at the top glared up at me. Patient name Howard Robert, age 68, my father. The man who hadn't called in 3 years. The man who had chosen a traffic court hearing over my doctorate. He was here in my hospital on my turf, and his heart was failing. Miller watched me closely. "Bernice, I can assign Dr. Evans to assist, or I can try to fly in a specialist from Chicago, but that will take 6 hours. He doesn't have 6 hours." I stared at the name, the letters blurring slightly. Fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. My father needed the exact procedure I had mastered to spite him. I walked from the chief's office to the family consultation room in the ICU wing, a distance of exactly 400 yards. I used those 400 yards to reconstruct the walls I had spent a lifetime building. I wasn't a daughter walking to see her estranged parents. I was the attending surgeon briefing the next of kin. I focused on the cadence of my heels on the linoleum, a sharp, authoritative click that usually made residents scatter. I needed that armor because the people behind door 304 weren't just difficult relatives. They were the architects of my deepest insecurities. I paused with my hand on the brushed steel handle, taking a breath that filled my diaphragm, but didn't expand my chest, a singer's trick, a surgeon's habit. I pushed the door open. The room was a windowless box designed to contain grief, painted in offensive shades of calming beige. They were sitting on the love seat, huddled together like conspirators. My mother, Ellen, looked smaller than I remembered. She was wearing a cardigan that had seen better days, clutching her purse to her chest, as if she expected to be mugged. Beside her sat Kyle. If I had been a stranger, I might have been impressed by the superficial gloss of him. He was wearing a navy suit that I recognized as Italian, likely costing more than my first car, and a watch that glinted aggressively under the fluorescent lights. But I wasn't a stranger. I was a clinician trained to look for pathology, and Kyle was riddled with it. The suit was wrinkled at the elbows and stained near the cuff, suggesting he had been wearing it for days. His hair, usually gelled into submission, was thinning and unkempt at the nape of his neck. "Bernice?" My mother's voice was a waver, uncertain and thin. She stood up halfway, then sat back down, unsure of the protocol for greeting the child she had ghosted 3 years ago. "Oh, thank God." When the nurse said Dr. Howard, I thought maybe— well, I didn't know if you were still here. I work here, Mother, I said, my voice maintaining the cool professional detachment I reserved for insurance auditors. I didn't move to hug her. I didn't smile. I walked to the head of the small conference table and placed my father's chart down with a heavy thud. I am the lead cardiothoracic surgeon for this department. Kyle let out a short, scoffing laugh. He leaned back, spreading his legs in a display of unearned dominance. Lead surgeon, good for you, Bernie. Moving up in the world. Look, can we cut the reunion tour? We need to know what's going on with Dad. The ambulance ride alone probably cost a fortune, and these people are talking about surgery like it's a foregone conclusion. I turned my gaze to him. He flinched just slightly. It is a foregone conclusion, Kyle. Dad has a type A aortic dissection involving the root complicated by severe mitral regurgitation. His heart is essentially a ticking time bomb. The wall of his aorta is tearing apart. If we don't operate within the next 12 hours, the rupture will kill him instantly. My mother let out a whimper, pressing a tissue to her mouth. Oh, Kyle. Oh, God. Kyle didn't look at her. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. 12 hours. That sounds like a scare tactic. Doctors always pad the numbers to force a decision. He stood up, pacing the small room. Look, Bernie, we appreciate you being here, really. It's nice to have an insider. But we need to be realistic about the finances here. Dad's insurance isn't what it used to be since he retired, and the co-pays at a research hospital like St. Jude's are astronomical. We have to think about the long term. The estate. The estate. I repeated the words, tasting like ash. His life is the priority. The estate is irrelevant if he's dead. It's not irrelevant to those of us who have to manage the family's future. Kyle snapped, his facade of cool confidence cracking for a second. He took a breath, smoothing his tie. I know a guy, Dr. Varghese. He runs a clinic just across the state line in Hammond. It's a private facility, very efficient. He did Uncle Jerry's hip replacement. He owes me a favor. He can do the heart thing for a third of the price St. Jude's charges. I've already texted him. He says if we get Dad there by tonight, he can squeeze him in. I stared at him, processing the sheer lunacy of his statement. You want to move a patient with an active aortic dissection 3 hours in an ambulance to a budget clinic to save money. Dr. Varghese is an orthopedic consultant, Kyle. He fixes hips. He doesn't reconstruct aortic valves. You're talking about taking a man with a grenade in his chest and driving him over potholes to a discount mechanic. He has a cardiac team, Kyle argued, his face flushing red. And it's not a budget clinic, it's a cost-effective alternative. You've been in your ivory tower too long, Bernice. You don't know what it's like out there in the real economy. Dad would want us to be smart with the money. He wouldn't want to drain the accounts just for some premium brand-name surgery. I looked at my mother. Mom, are you hearing this? He wants to gamble Dad's life to save a few $1,000s. Ellen looked between us, her eyes wide and watery. She looked terrified, but not of the surgery. She was terrified of Kyle. Bernie, honey, Kyle handles all the finances now. He knows best. He's been taking such good care of the accounts since your father got sick. If he says we can't afford it here, then maybe we should listen. I looked back at Kyle, and this time I really looked. I engaged the part of my brain that dissected problems. Why was he so desperate? The suit was expensive, yes, but his fingernails were bitten down to the quick, a sign of extreme chronic anxiety. There was a slight tremor in his left hand when he wasn't moving it. He kept tapping his pocket, checking his phone every 30 seconds. I saw the screen light up briefly, a notification from a number saved as priority collections. And then I saw the shoes. They were Gucci loafers, but the sole of the right one was separating, held together by a dab of superglue that had dried white and crusty. The realization hit me with the clarity of a diagnosis. There was no estate. Kyle had drained it. He wasn't trying to save money for our parents. He was trying to stop the bleeding of his own disastrous mismanagement. He needed a cheap surgery because he couldn't pay the deductible here. He likely couldn't pay the deductible anywhere, but a sketchy clinic in Hammond might take a payment plan or a bribe, whereas St. Jude's demanded verification. He was drowning and he was using our father's body as a raft. "You're broke," I said. It wasn't a question. Kyle froze. "Excuse me." "You're in debt." I continued, stepping closer to him. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The shaking hands, the constant phone checking. "You're not managing the estate, Kyle. You're liquidating it. That's why you want the cheap option. You need the difference. What is it, gambling, crypto, or just good old-fashioned bad investments?" "You don't know what you're talking about," Kyle hissed, stepping into my personal space. He smelled of stale coffee and desperation. "I am the medical power of attorney. Dad signed the papers 5 years ago. I make the decisions, not you, not Mom, me, and I am deciding that we are transferring him to Hammond. Now get out of my way and authorize the discharge." He pulled a folded dog-eared document from his inside pocket and slammed it onto the table next to the chart. It was a standard durable power of attorney for healthcare. I glanced at the signature, my father's shaky scrawl. It was legally binding. Technically, Kyle held the reins. He could order us to stop treatment. He could order a transfer against medical advice. My mother was sobbing softly now. "Please stop fighting. Bernice, just do what your brother says. He's the POA." I looked at the document, then at Kyle's smug, sweaty face. He thought he had won. He thought the piece of paper trumped the reality of biology. He thought he could bully me the way he used to when we were kids, mocking my textbooks and calling me a nerd while he was out crashing cars. But I wasn't the little sister anymore. I was the surgeon who held a man's heart in her hands and commanded it to beat. "You have the authority to make decisions," I said softly. "But that authority is contingent on the patient's stability." "What?" Kyle narrowed his eyes. "St. Jude's policy," I lied smoothly. Well, it was a half-lie. It was a policy I could enforce if I chose to be rigid. We cannot release a patient for transfer if the attending physician deems them unstable for transport. If I sign a discharge order for a patient in this condition and he dies in the ambulance, which he will, I lose my license. And you go to prison for manslaughter. "Manslaughter," Kyle's voice cracked. "Negligent homicide," I corrected, leaning in. "If you override the specialist's recommendation and move him to an inadequate facility and he dies, the hospital legal team will flag it. The insurance company will investigate, and they will find out about your debts, Kyle. They will find out you moved him to save money you didn't have. It will look like you killed him for the inheritance." I let that hang in the air. "Is that a risk you want to take because I will testify against you?" "I will tell the jury exactly what I saw in this room." Kyle went pale. He looked at the POA in his hand, then at his mother, then back at me. He was cornered. He needed the money, but he was terrified of the law. He was a coward, and cowards always folded when the stakes got real. "Fine," he spat, shoving the paper back into his pocket. "Do the surgery. But I'm not paying for the platinum package. You get him out of here as soon as he wakes up." "We'll see," I said. I turned to my mother. "I need to prep. Don't come to the waiting room on the surgical floor. I don't want to see you until it's done." I walked out before they could respond. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage. I had bought my father time, but I had done it by threatening my own brother with prison. I walked back toward the scrub rooms, my hands curling into fists. I would save Robert Howard. I would fix his heart with the skill he had ignored, and I would make sure Kyle paid for every single stitch. The surgery was no longer just a procedure. It was a reckoning. The waiver had been signed. It sat on the counter of the nurse's station, a single sheet of paper that legally bound Kyle to his cowardice. He had scribbled his name with a shaking hand, terrified by the prospect of a manslaughter charge, and then retreated to the waiting room to play the role of the concerned son. I didn't watch him go. I had turned my back on the family to face the only thing that mattered, the sterile field. Now, 2 hours later, I stood over the open chest cavity of my father. The draping was extensive blue sheets covering every inch of him except for the 10-inch square of illuminated flesh in the center of his sternum. This was the psychological trick every surgeon learned early: cover the face, cover the hands, cover the tattoos. Erase the human being until only the problem remains. I wasn't looking at Robert Howard, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and then forgotten to come to my medical school graduation. I was looking at a type A dissection with a dilated aortic root. I was looking at plumbing that had failed. "Clamp on," I said, my voice muffled by the mask, but clear enough for the team. "Initiating cardiopulmonary bypass. Flow is up, pressure is stable," the perfusionist called out from behind the bypass machine. "Heart is arrested." The room fell into that deep synthetic silence. The rhythmic whoosh click of the ventilator stopped. The heart, a muscle that had beaten over 2 billion times, lay still and pale in the pericardial sac. It was a strange, godlike feeling to stop a life in order to save it. I picked up the scalpel. Proceeding with the aortotomy, I sliced into the aorta. The damage was worse than the imaging had suggested. The inner layer of the vessel had shredded, creating a false lumen where blood had been pooling, stretching the outer wall to the transparency of tissue paper. It was a catastrophic failure. If we had moved him, if he had hit even a minor pothole on the way to Kyle's budget clinic, this vessel would have burst, and he would have been dead before the ambulance stopped rolling. "Tissue is extremely friable," Evans whispered, his suction tip hovering nervously near my hands. "It's like wet cardboard, Dr. Howard. How are you going to anchor the graft?" "We're not going to anchor it to the damage," I said, my eyes scanning the anatomy. "We're going to perform the Thornton-Vance modification. I need to re-implant the coronary arteries directly into the graft. 5-aeroproline, Castroviejo needle holder." This was the crux of the surgery, the moment where competence met catastrophe. I had to excise the diseased portion of the aorta, including the valve, and replace it with a synthetic tube, then sew the tiny arteries that fed the heart muscle itself back into that tube. It required a level of dexterity that bordered on the inhuman. One tremor, one slipped stitch, and the connection would leak. A leak here meant death. I began the suturing. My hands moved with a fluidity that felt separate from my body. I was a machine. Insert, rotate, pull. Insert, rotate, pull. I didn't think about the man on the table. I didn't think about the debt Kyle was hiding. I didn't think about my mother's tears. I thought about the tension of the thread. I thought about the angle of the needle. "Dr. Howard," the anesthesiologist said, his voice rising an octave, "cerebral oximetry is dropping on the left side. We might have a clot." "Maintain perfusion pressure," I ordered, not looking up. "Evans, adjust the sucker. You're obscuring the left main ostium." I can't see it," Evans stammered. "There's too much back bleeding." "Don't look for the blood, look for the source," I snapped. I reached in blind, my gloved finger finding the tear in the artery wall that was hidden by the flow. I could feel the pulse of the machine pushing blood against my fingertip. "I have it. Give me a pledgeted suture, now." Mag slapped the instrument into my hand instantly. She didn't flinch. She had seen me work for 5 years. She knew I didn't panic. I drove the needle through the delicate tissue using a small felt patch to reinforce the wall so the thread wouldn't tear through. It was a high-risk maneuver, something they told you in textbooks was a last resort, but it was the only card I had left to play. I tied the knot. The bleeding stopped. Cerebral sats returning to baseline. The anesthesiologist exhaled. I didn't celebrate. I moved to the next vessel. For the next 3 hours, time dissolved. It was just me and the geometry of the heart. When I finally unclamped the graft and allowed warm blood to flow back into the organ, the room held its collective breath. This was the moment of truth. Would it beat? Or had we damaged the conduction system? The heart sat still for a terrifying 10 seconds. Then a fibrillation, a chaotic quiver. "Internal paddles," I said. Mags handed them to me. I slipped the spoons around the heart. Clear. Thump. The body jerked. On the monitor, A jagged green line shot up, then fell, then shot up again. Beep, beep, beep. A normal sinus rhythm. Strong, regular. "We have a heartbeat," Evans said, sounding like he might cry. "Good flow in the graft. No leaks." I stepped back, dropping my hands to my sides. The exhaustion hit me like a physical blow, a wave of lead filling my veins. I looked down at the surgical field. The chest was still open, the retractors holding the ribs apart, but the heart inside was beating with a renewed, vigorous rhythm. I had done it. I had fixed the engine of the man who had driven away from me. "Close him up, Evans," I said, my voice raspy. "Standard closure. Do a good job on the skin. Mags, stay with him until he's in the ICU." "You're not staying?" Evans asked, surprised. "My job is the repair," I said, peeling off my blood-soaked gown. "The rest is just recovery." I walked out of the OR and into the scrub room. I washed my hands for the second time that day, watching the rust-colored water swirl away. I felt hollowed out. There was no triumph, only the grim satisfaction of a job completed. I checked my reflection in the mirror. I looked pale, my eyes dark circles of fatigue, but my expression was unchanged. The Ice Queen was still intact. I changed into my white coat, draping it over my scrubs like a shield. I had to go to the waiting room. I had to tell them he was alive. I had to listen to Kyle take credit for authorizing the best care. The thought made my stomach churn. I walked down the long, sterile corridor toward the surgical waiting area, my footsteps heavy. As I approached the double doors of the waiting room, I slowed down. Through the narrow vertical window, I could see them. My mother was sitting with her head in her hands. Kyle was standing by the vending machine, talking on his phone, gesturing wildly. He looked energized, manic even. He wasn't acting like a grieving son. He was acting like a man who had just dodged a bullet. I reached for the handle, but before I could push it, the door swung open from the inside. It wasn't my family. It was Mags. The head nurse was still in her blue scrubs, a surgical cap covering her gray hair. She was a large woman, built like a linebacker with a face that had seen every tragedy a hospital could offer. She stepped out, blocking the doorway with her body, effectively sealing the waiting room off from the corridor where I stood. She crossed her arms over her chest. "He's asking for you," Mag said, her voice low and rough. "My father." "No, the brother, Kyle." She spat the name like it was a curse word. "He's been pacing in there for an hour, telling your mother how he managed the situation and how he's going to have a talk with administration about the bill." I let out a dry, bitter laugh. "Of course he is. Let me pass, Mags. I need to get this over with." Mags didn't move. She stood like a sentinel, her eyes locked on mine. "You're not going in there, Dr. Howard. You look like you're about to fall over. You saved the patient. You did the miracle. You don't have to do the PR." "They're my family, Mags. Unfortunately." "Are they?" Mags tilted her head. "Because I walked past the cafeteria on my break before the surgery started. I heard him on the phone." I froze. "What?" Mags stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "He wasn't talking to a doctor. He was talking to someone named Vinny or Vance, something like that. He was begging for more time. He said, 'The old man is sick, the inheritance is coming, I just need a few more weeks.' He didn't want the cheap clinic to save the estate, Bernice. He wanted the cheap clinic because he's already spent the money he hasn't inherited yet." The confirmation hit me harder than the surgery had. I had suspected it, I had diagnosed it, but hearing it out loud, confirmed by a witness, turned the suspicion into a weapon. "He's betting on the death," I whispered. "He was hedging his bets," Mags corrected. "But you ruined his odds. You kept the old man alive." Suddenly the door behind Mags jerked open. Kyle stood there, his face flushed. He saw me and immediately put on his concerned head of household mask. "Bernice," he exclaimed, stepping into the hallway. "Finally. We've been waiting for hours. Is he... Did you..." "He's alive," I said flatly. "The surgery was a success." Kyle blinked. For a split second, I saw the disappointment flash in his eyes before he covered it with a wide, fake smile. That's wonderful, Mom. He made it. He turned back to shout into the room, then turned to me, puffing out his chest. See, I told Mom we should trust you even if the cost is crazy. I'm glad you listened to me about the urgency. I opened my mouth to eviscerate him, to scream, to tell him I knew about Vinny and the debt and the betrayal. But Mags moved faster. She stepped between us, a wall of blue cotton. She turned her back to me and faced Kyle, looming over him by a good 2 inches. You listen to me, Mags said, her voice a low growl that carried the authority of 30 years in the trauma unit. Dr. Howard just performed a procedure that only 5 people in this country can do. She stood on her feet for 5 hours to fix the mess inside your father's chest. She is exhausted. She is done. Excuse me. Kyle bristled, trying to look past her. I'm her brother. I want to see my father. You aren't seeing anyone, Mags said, stepping into his space until he was forced to retreat back toward the doorframe. The patient is in recovery. It's a restricted zone, no visitors, especially not visitors who tried to bargain hunt for cardiac surgery. Now wait a minute. Kyle started, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. She saved him despite you, not because of you. Mags cut him off, her voice ringing out in the hallway loud enough for my mother to hear inside the room. And she isn't coming out here to be berated or managed by a man who was placing bets on his father's life in the cafeteria while she was scrubbing in. The silence that followed was absolute. Kyle's jaw dropped. Inside the room, my mother stood up, her hand flying to her mouth. Mags didn't back down. I'm the head nurse on this floor. I control who enters the ICU, and right now you are banned from the recovery room. You're a stressor, and stressors kill patients. Go home, wait for the bill. She turned back to me, her expression softening instantly. Go to your office, Bernice. Lock the door. I'll handle the update. I've got the watch. I looked at Mags, then at Kyle's stunned, guilty face. I realized then that family wasn't blood. Family was the people who stood in the gap for you. Family was the shield. Thank you, Mags, I whispered. I turned and walked away, the sound of Mags shutting the door in Kyle's face, echoing behind me like a gavel striking a sounding block. I retreated to my office, a glass-walled sanctuary, overlooking the city skyline, and locked the door. The adrenaline of the surgery had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I sat at my desk, the mahogany surface bare, except for a single computer terminal and a stack of billing forms. Most surgeons hated the paperwork. They found the coding and the insurance authorizations tedious. I found them to be a different kind of scalpel, less bloody perhaps, but capable of cutting much deeper if you knew where to apply the pressure. I logged into the hospital's financial system. My clearance level allowed me to view the complete breakdown of the Howard Robert account. The numbers were staggering. A Thornton Vance reconstruction combined with the emergency bypass, the ICU stay, and the anesthesia totaled well over $300,000. I cracked my knuckles and began to type. This was the second phase of the operation. The surgical repair was for my father's heart. This administrative repair was for my own soul. I pulled up the charity care waiver. As a senior attending physician at St. Jude's, I had the discretionary power to waive the hospital's facility fees for immediate family members. I filled out the digital form, absorbing the cost of the room, the board, and the nursing care. I wiped nearly $100,000 of debt off the ledger with a single keystroke. It was a gesture of immense generosity, one that would look saintly to any outsider. But I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it to isolate the variable I wanted to control. Next, I opened the billing portal for Howard Surgical Associates, the private practice entity through which the surgeons billed their professional fees. This was separate from the hospital. This was my fee. The insurance company would deny the bulk of it because Kyle, in his infinite wisdom, had refused to provide the updated policy information upon admission, insisting on a transfer instead. By the time the system processed the claim, it would be flagged as out of network, Emergency override denied due to incomplete data. That meant the financial liability fell to the guarantor. I looked at the admission documents scanned into the system. There it was, Kyle's signature on the guarantor of payment line, right next to his signature on the refusal of care waiver he had tried to push earlier. He had signed everything in a flurry of arrogance, assuming he could bully the system later. I generated the invoice. Surgeon's fee, $75,000. Anesthesiology group fee, $12,000. I printed it on heavy cream-colored bond paper. Then I pulled a sheet of personal stationery from my drawer. I picked up my fountain pen. I didn't need a draft. I had been writing this letter in my head for 3 years, editing it while I drove to work, refining it while I scrubbed and polishing it, while I tried to sleep in the on-call room. I wrote quickly, the black ink flowing smoothly onto the page. I folded the letter around the invoice and slid both into a thick, official-looking envelope. I sealed it with a sharp press of my thumb. I stood up, smoothed my white coat, and picked up the envelope. It felt heavy, like a dense brick of uranium. I walked back to the ICU. The unit was quiet. The lights dimmed for the evening shift. I didn't go to room 304. Instead, I went to the central monitoring station. Mags was there, sitting behind the bank of screens that displayed the vitals of every patient on the floor. She looked up as I approached, her eyes scanning my face for cracks in the armor. Finding none, she nodded toward the monitor labeled Bead 4. "He's extubated," Mags said quietly. "Woke up 10 minutes ago. He's lucid, confused but lucid." "Is the intercom on?" I asked. Mags pressed a button on the console. The static hiss cleared, replaced by the sounds from inside the room. I could hear the beep of the monitor, the rustle of sheets, and the low murmur of voices. I stood there watching the grainy black and white video feed. I was the ghost in the machine, the invisible observer. Where is she?" My father's voice was raspy, a throat raked raw by the breathing tube. The nurse said, "Bernice." I saw my mother on the screen, leaning over the bed rail, stroking his forehead. "Shh, Robert. Rest. You've had a big surgery." "Bernice," he insisted, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. "I want to see her. Is she here?" Kyle stepped into the frame. He looked disheveled. His tie loosened, his earlier manic energy replaced by a nervous twitchiness. "She's around Dad. She's busy. You know how these doctors are. Big shots." "I want to thank her," my father wheezed. I remember seeing her eyes. Before I went under. It was her." I watched my own hand tighten on the counter of the nurse's station. He remembered. He wanted to thank me. A younger, weaker version of myself might have softened. She might have walked into that room weeping, desperate for the crumbs of affection he was finally offering. But I remembered the graduation. I remembered the silence. I remembered that he was only asking for me now because I was the savior. I wasn't the daughter, I was the asset. "Mags," I said, sliding the envelope across the counter. "Deliver this, please." Mags looked at the envelope, then at me. She didn't ask what was in it. She understood the assignment. "You got it, Doc." She picked up the package and marched down the hall. On the screen, I watched the door to room 304 open. Mags entered the frame. "Mr. Howard," Mags's voice came through the intercom, professional and firm. "Dr. Howard has completed her rounds for the evening. She has left instructions for your post-operative care with the night team." "She left." My father sounded crushed. "But I'm her father." "She is a very busy surgeon," Mags said, placing the thick envelope on the bedside table. "She asked me to give you this. It contains the discharge protocols and administrative paperwork." "Paperwork," Kyle scoffed, reaching for the envelope. "Classic. Send the bill before the patient can even sit up." I watched Kyle rip the envelope open. He pulled out the stack of papers. The first thing he saw was the letter. He frowned, holding it up so my mother could read over his shoulder. "What is it?" my mother asked. "Read it, Kyle." Kyle hesitated, his eyes scanning the page. On the screen, I saw the color drain from his face. He went pale, then gray. "Read it." My father commanded, his voice weak but sharp. Kyle cleared his throat, his hand shaking. He began to read aloud, his voice trembling. "To Robert and Ellen," he read. "Today, I performed a Thornton Vance reconstruction on Robert's heart. It is a procedure that requires absolute precision, a skill I acquired during the 3 years I spent in the library instead of at family dinners. I saved your life, Dad. I did it because I am a professional and I took an oath. But that oath dictates that I do no harm. It does not dictate that I endure it." Kyle paused, swallowing hard. My mother was weeping silently on the screen. "You missed the moment I became a doctor because you were too busy enabling the son who would eventually gamble away your security. Today I fixed the damage caused by your genetics and your lifestyle. I have waived the hospital fees. Consider that my final gift to the family. However, the specialist fees are enclosed. They are billed to the guarantor Kyle, who assumed financial responsibility when he attempted to block necessary medical care. I have saved you despite yourselves. We are even. Do not contact me. I have work to do. Dr. Bernice Howard." Silence filled the room. Absolute suffocating silence. Then Kyle flipped the page to the invoice. 75,000. He whispered the number, choking him. "Plus 12 for anesthesia, $87,000, due immediately." "You have the money, Kyle," my mother said, her voice rising in panic. "The estate money, the accounts you manage." I watched Kyle on the screen. I saw the trap snap shut. He couldn't tell them he had spent it. He couldn't tell them the accounts were empty. He was holding a bill for $87,000 that he was legally liable for in front of the parents he had lied to. I need to make a call," Kyle stammered, backing away from the bed. "Where are you going?" my father rasped, struggling to sit up. The monitor alarms beeped a warning as his heart rate spiked. "Kyle, you said the money was safe." I reached out and pressed the button on the intercom, cutting the audio. The shouting in the room became a silent movie. I watched them argue. I watched the realization dawn on my father's face, the betrayal of the son, the competence of the daughter, and the finalized loss of both. "He's tachycardia," Mags noted, looking at the numbers. "Should I go in?" "Give it a minute," I said, my voice steady. "His heart is fixed. It's his reality that's breaking. There's no surgery for that." I turned away from the screen. The weight in my chest was gone. I felt light. I felt clean. The bill had been delivered and the cost was finally being paid by the right person. The collapse of the Howard family dynasty did not happen with a bang, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of a tectonic shift. It took exactly 48 hours for the bill I delivered to detonate the fragile foundation Kyle had built on lies and leverage. When the $87,000 invoice hit the table, it acted as a stress test for a system that was already failing. Kyle, panicked and cornered by the immediate demand for payment, made a series of frantic, sloppy financial maneuvers that flagged the attention of the state banking regulators. It turned out that managing the estate had been a euphemism for a sophisticated shell game of wire fraud and embezzlement. He had been moving my parents' retirement funds into high-risk crypto wallets and online gambling accounts, covering his losses with new loans in my father's name. The cheap clinic in Hammond wasn't just a budget option. It was a desperate attempt to avoid the scrutiny of a major hospital's billing department, which he knew would expose his insolvency. The fallout was comprehensive. 2 days after the surgery, while my father was being transferred from the ICU to the cardiac step-down unit, 2 gentlemen in cheap suits and grim expressions arrived at the hospital. They weren't doctors. They were investigators from the district attorney's office, accompanied by a fraud specialist from the insurance company. They intercepted Kyle in the cafeteria, the same place where he had tried to barter away our father's life. I didn't witness the arrest. I was in surgery, removing a benign myxoma from a teenager's atrium, but Mags told me later. She said Kyle cried. She said he tried to blame the market. She said he looked at the handcuffs like they were alien artifacts that couldn't possibly belong on his wrists. He was charged with elder abuse, financial fraud, and identity theft. The golden child had finally rusted through. My parents were left in the wreckage. My father, recovering from a surgery that required low stress and constant care, was discharged into a reality that was colder than the operating room. There was no money left for a private nurse. There was no inheritance to protect. The family home, the one they had prioritized over my education, was leveraged to the hilt. But the financial ruin was secondary to the social necrosis that set in. In their tight-knit community, the narrative flipped overnight. The story of the cold, ungrateful daughter was replaced by the scandal of the thief's son. The church prayer chain, usually a source of comfort, became a grapevine of judgment. The neighbors who used to wave now looked away. My parents were isolated, trapped in a house filled with memories of their own poor investments, both financial and emotional. They had bet everything on the wrong horse, and now they had to walk home. 2 weeks later, I stood in my office at St. Jude's for the last time. The room echoed, stripping away the professional veneer I had worn like a second skin. My bookshelves were empty, the heavy medical texts packed into cardboard boxes, labeled for shipping. I had accepted a fellowship at the Cleveland Clinic, a position that would focus on advanced aortic repair. It was a step up, a leap into a stratosphere of medicine, where I would be judged solely by the steadiness of my hands, not the baggage of my last name. I ran my hand over the mahogany desk, feeling the smooth, cool wood. I left the ficus plant. It needed more light than I could give it, and I didn't want to drag anything dead into my new life. The door opened, and Mag stepped in. She wasn't wearing her scrubs. She was in street clothes, a sensible floral blouse and slacks. It was jarring to see her out of uniform, like seeing a general without their medals. She held a coffee cup in each hand. She extended one to me. "Black 2 sugars," she said. "Fuel for the road." I took the cup. "Thank you, Mags." She leaned against the doorframe, surveying the empty office. "Cleveland, huh? They get a lot of snow, but they have good hearts, in the jars, I mean." "It's a good opportunity," I said, taking a sip. The coffee was hot, bitter, and grounding. "I need a new theater." Mags nodded slowly. "You do. You outgrew this place about 3 years ago, Bernice. You just stuck around waiting for... Well, I guess you were waiting for them to show up." "I wasn't waiting for them," I corrected gently. "I was waiting for the opportunity to close the loop. A suture isn't secure until you tie the knot and cut the thread." Mag smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "You're a terrifying woman, Dr. Howard, and a hell of a surgeon. I'm going to miss watching you work. Evans is going to be lead resident now. God help us all." "He'll be fine. Just don't let him lean on the suction." We stood in silence for a moment, the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who have seen blood and death together. There were no hugs. We weren't huggers. We were soldiers who had survived the same war. "Your father asked about you this morning," Mag said, her voice neutral. "He asked if you left a forwarding address. And I told him you vanished into thin air." Mag said, a wicked glint in her eye. "I told him ghosts don't have zip codes." I felt a smile tug at my lips, a real one. Perfect. I picked up my box of personal effects, my degree, my stethoscope, and a framed photo of the day I got into medical school, the only day I remembered being truly happy before the work took over. "Take care of the place, Mags. Keep the cowboys in line." "Always," she said, raising her coffee cup in a salute. "Go get 'em, Ice Queen." I walked out of the office, down the long corridor of the surgical wing, and into the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. As the car descended, I felt the phantom weight of the last 3 years lifting off my shoulders. I watched the numbers count down, 4, 3, 2, 1. The doors slid open with a soft chime. I walked through the lobby, past the donor wall, past the reception desk where anxious families waited for news. I walked through the automatic sliding doors and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. The air was crisp and smelled of rain and exhaust, the perfume of the city. I didn't look back at the hospital. I didn't look back at the ICU window, where my father lay recovering in the ruins of his own making. I walked toward the parking garage, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic beat on the pavement. I had entered that building as a daughter seeking validation. I was leaving it as a woman who had validated herself. I had saved the patient, billed the enemy, and protected the surgeon. True revenge. I realized as I unlocked my car and tossed the box into the passenger seat, wasn't about screaming or fighting or inflicting pain. It wasn't messy. True revenge was competence. It was the ability to fix what they broke, present them with the invoice, and then simply surgically excise them from your life. I started the engine. The radio came on, playing a song I didn't know, but the rhythm was upbeat driving. I pulled out of the lot and merged into traffic, heading toward the highway, toward Cleveland, toward the future. The rearview mirror was just a piece of glass. I tilted it up until all I could see was the sky. That brings us to the end of Bernice's journey, proving that sometimes the sharpest cuts are the most necessary ones for healing. If you enjoyed this medical drama and the satisfying taste of justice, please hit that subscribe button and share your reaction. What did you think of her final decision? Let us know below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.